Let's open our Bibles, please, to the book of Matthew, chapter 10. Matthew, chapter 10. And I know all of you are praying for a foot of snow tonight, but well, maybe not all of us, okay? You know how much snow we're going to get, really? Whatever God sends us, that's how much we'll get. All right, Matthew chapter 10. Begin reading with verse 1. And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against unclean spirits, to cast them out, and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the publican, James the son of Alphaeus and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Last week we got a glimpse of the man himself named John. We saw that he was a rough and tough fisherman. And we gave some examples how that as a fisherman, Peter, who we saw was a partner with John, Peter pulled 150 large fish, even at 5 pounds. That would have been 750 pounds that Peter pulled to the shore when they saw Jesus on shore cooking fish for them. We can only assume that John would have been at least as strong, and there's strong indication John was younger than Peter, so he may have even been stronger than Peter. He was not some weak, puny, sickly sort of guy. He was a rough and tough fisherman. We saw that he probably came from a very wealthy family, and we looked at some verses. But when God called him out, he left everything without hesitation. And I spent quite a bit of time on that. I won't again. But a lot of problem with churches today is when God speaks to our heart, we put it off, we resist it, I'm not going to do it, and a host of other things. He left everything. He gave up fame. He gave up fortune. He gave up having a nice house and a nice bedroom with a nice bed to sleep on. He gave up having food stored. You know, I know whenever there's a snowstorm coming, if you want bread, milk, and a couple of other things, you better be at Kroger's when they unlock the doors, because for some reason people panic and they buy everything off the shelves. Most of us, at least the ones that I am most familiar with, we have enough food, either canned, frozen, or something. By canned, I mean the old-fashioned canning. We have enough food that we could probably live for several weeks. John gave up everything, followed Jesus, who Jesus said on one occasion, I have no place to lay my head. He didn't have a pantry to keep food in. He went from having a life of wealth to a life of every day having to get their daily food. That's why Jesus said, give us this day our 6-month supply of food. Give us this day our daily bread. That's how they lived. They lived with no certain place to sleep. They lived with no certain food guaranteed. And yet John did it without hesitation because God called him. Though he was a strong, muscular man, we'll see tonight, he demonstrated tremendous meekness and humility in his life. Let's get in. I said this morning we would be looking at what he was. We saw who he was. Tonight we're going to look more at what he was. And then next week, Lord willing, we'll look at some of the things he accomplished under the leadership of God. The first thing that came to my mind when I began thinking what he was, and I don't mean, was he still in the ape stage? I don't mean anything of that. I mean, what positions did he hold? What was his personality? And more in that line. The first thing I thought of, he was a member of the first church called, baptized by John the Baptist, called out by Jesus Christ, and assembled from that time forth. There's a certain prestige in being first. I've said it in school. They never put me on anything that would involve any kind of physical stability, any kind of physical mobility. Even in gym class, which, do they still have gym class today? Okay, they still have gym today in some schools. In gym class, whether we were playing, basketball in the class, whether we were doing anything, I was always dead last to be chosen. And the only reason I was chosen then is because the coach said, he's the last player, you get the last pick, he's on your team. But Mr. Sled, he's on your team. How would you like to grow up with that complex? I was never chosen first for anything in the physical realm. My specialty was more the geek side, not geek, the scholarly side. Math team. I went every year and represented our school on the math team. I was on the debate team. I was on the you name it, intellectually, that was me. Physically, I had nothing. But it was nice being first. It was always nice to be first, whether it was, first in the math contest, whether it was first in something else. Even as a young man at church, and I thought about this, I thought about doing it some night in one of our picnics or one of our get-togethers. How many of you know what an old-fashioned sword drill is? Ooh, quite a few of you. I had to be first in that. I had to be first in something. And there's something. How many baseball teams go into the year and think, oh, I hope and pray we lose the World Series? How many football teams go in and whatever we do not want to make the Super Bowl? Is that football? Okay, want to make sure. How many people go in and to the Olympics and think, oh, I hope and pray I lose every contest. Nobody that I know of works that hard, whether it be the World Series, whether it be the Super Bowl, whether it be the gold medal in Olympics, or simply being called to the head of the line. Hey, we're glad to have you with us tonight. Would you please come forward so I can introduce you? We all like to be first in some things. John was chosen to be the core of the first church. What constitutes a church? And it's time I need to preach on this some Sunday again. What constitutes a church? First of all, you must be saved. If you're not saved, I don't care if you've been baptized. I don't care if I baptized you. I don't care if Brother Ginn baptized you. I don't care who baptized you. If you're not saved, you cannot be a member of the Lord's kind of church. So you must be saved. Then you must be scripturally baptized. I had a guy call me, I don't know, it seems like a couple of weeks ago, it may have been a month, but he called me. He was passing through town. He was a truck driver. He was passing through town, and God laid upon his heart that he needed to be baptized, and so he called to see if I would baptize him passing through. Well, you would be a member of our church. Oh, no. I don't want to be a member of a church. I just want to be baptized. And I gave him some other churches that might consider it. You must be saved. You must be scripturally baptized. And at that point, you are added to the church. Then you must assemble. Now, we looked at this on Wednesday night a year or so ago. I don't know if this is Satan putting thoughts in my brain. You cannot be a member of a universal, invisible church. It's impossible. It's kind of like having a universal, invisible wife. Now, there may be times when you wish she was invisible or he was invisible. There is no scripture anywhere for a universal church, and there's no scripture anywhere for an invisible church. Every church that is mentioned in the Bible is always a local, visible, assembled group of people. You can't be a church and not be assembled. Just throw that out, because it is going to tie in. Well, what about John? He was baptized by the only person on earth at that time who was sent from God to baptize. John the Baptist was the only person in all the earth that was specifically sent by God for the purpose of baptizing the first members of the church. Well, how do we know that John was baptized by John? In Acts chapter 1, as Judas had hung himself, they now were replacing him with another apostle. And one of the qualifications is that is given there in Acts chapter 1. You must have been baptized by John the Baptist, and you must have continued from that day forward. You must have continued with Christ. So we know that John the Apostle was, or he would not have been an apostle. He was called by Jesus Christ himself. One of the things that is not unique to our church, there are many churches that do, we invite people to come. We hope and pray God will add unto us. But we know that God has to be the one to add them. In my early years, I added people to the church. By that, I mean I pressured them. I did everything. And they joined. You know what happened. They became the biggest pain in my neck you've ever seen. I told some people today we ate out, and I always leave them with a tract or pen or sometimes both. And I say, this is an invitation. We would love to have you, but we're not going to come to your house. We're not going to beg you. We're not going to pull you. We're not going to pressure you. We believe that just as God called out John and we saw Peter and John, Peter's brother. We looked at that last week. We saw that he called out Peter, and he called out James, and he called out John, and then he placed them in the church by assembling. So we still believe that God adds to the church. We believe that. We practice that. Well, the next thing we know is that John was ordained as an apostle. We notice in the verse that we read, and we could read it in other verses as well, these are the names of the 12 apostles. Simon, which is called Peter, Andrew, that was the other brother, and then James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. So I began thinking of this and thinking of John. I began thinking some of the qualifications in order to be a pastor. We don't have apostles today, but we have pastors today. And I am 1,000% positive apostles were no less stringent than pastors are today. So what were a few, and I just went through and picked out one or two that I thought were pertinent. Paul wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 6 that he must not be a novice. How many of you know what a novice is? Several of you. Okay. If I were to say he is a novice doctor, I had some tests several years ago. This has been several years ago. And the only place they could get it was over at UC. So I went in, they took me back to where the test was going to be run, and they had to place me face down on the table, and the doctor would go in and put a needle right between the vertebrae in my spine and shoot some stuff into my spine, and then they would watch it as it went throughout my body to see if there was any nerve or anything that wasn't right. So I'm being, this is pretty serious. So I'm trying to put some levity into the situation. And the doctor comes in and I say, you have done this before, haven't you? Yeah, I think you're number 18 or 19. And immediately my stomach began to get tight. I thought, okay. So then he tells the nurse, I want so many cc's of 50 milligrams of whatever this stuff was that they were going to inject. And the nurse said, no. And he said, I want this. And the nurse said, no. Now, I'm laying there on the table, and the doctor and the nurse are arguing over what to inject in me. Found out he was only like a third-year resident. If I had known that, I would have never let him in the room. So they get into a big argument. And I'm laying there, and they finally go outside, get the chair of that department. I could hear them arguing out in the hallway. And when they came back in, the nurse won. I found out later, had they injected me with what the doctor said, it would have blown my spine into 1,000 pieces, because it would have been so thick that my spine could not have handled it. He was a novice. I wrote a letter to the director. I wrote a letter to the chair. I wrote a letter to everybody. He's a novice. He should not, had I not had a nurse that was willing to stand up to a doctor and say, no, I would have blown my spine out. I would have been completely paralyzed. I don't want a novice. Now I ask, how many have you done? I don't want a novice operating on me. I don't want a novice who could literally kill me or permanently damage me. And Paul used the same idea. You don't want somebody in the ministry who is a novice. You don't want somebody who is, and there's a big debate whether it refers to age, whether it refers to experience, or what it refers to, but either way, you do not want a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. That doctor not only got mad at the first nurse, but because they were tracking the fluid in my back, they had a screen, and the lady would pull the screen up, and he would look and say, okay, I need to put the needle right there. He would stick the needle in, and he missed. So he said, bring that screen back up here. He brought it up, noted, wrote on my back where to put the needle, stuck the needle in, and he missed. He did that about 8 or 10 times. And had I known then what I know now, number 3 would have been his last time. After 3 tries, you can refuse any further attempts. He was a novice. And I'm laying there, and then he chewed the lady out because it was her fault that he missed because she didn't have the screen straight. He chewed her out. He was so full of pride and arrogance, you could see it and hear it in everything he did. I don't want a novice again. In fact, now that I know I don't have to, I won't. I don't want a novice doing something, operating, or anything else who hasn't had the experience and the knowledge to get it right the first time. I might give him 2, but I don't want a novice doing brain surgery on me. So a pastor should not be a novice. He should not be someone that is new to the area. And by area, I don't mean Kentucky, Tennessee. I mean new to leadership. But Paul goes on. Well, let me back up. I think we all, if we're honest, would agree that we all struggle with pride sometimes. I know most of us don't have anything to be proud of, but we struggle with it anyway. And to take someone who is still full of themselves, someone who is still proud and thinks they know it all, you don't put them into a position of leadership. I've noticed, and I was one of these. I guess that's one reason I look back and am so strong that myself is one of the reasons I am so strong. And I'm fixing to tell you where. I was ordained at the age of, we were married, I was 20, so I would have been 21 when I graduated college and was ordained to pastor my first church. Now, I was a little ahead of some because I had spent a year working under Brother Harvey, and he taught me on daily things. You don't do this. You don't handle it that way. I learned more in that year than I did probably in 4 years of knowledge. But when I pastored my first church, I'm pastor now. I'm pastor. If I say move, you better move. If I say jump, you better jump. If I say turn the lights off, you turn them off without question. I know it's hard to believe that with me. God took me through a lot of lumps. But I was so full of pride. Look at me. Look who I am. I see men even now that think because they're pastor, they have a direct line to God, whether it's plumbing, whether it's electric, whether it's construction. They think they have a direct line, and when they speak, it is a direct line from God. Whether it be plumbing or anything else, they are the final authority. And some of them are older than me and still have that mentality. Have you ever noticed people that don't have kids can always tell you how to raise kids? Well, how many kids have you raised? Oh, none. You've never raised a kid, but you think you can tell me with 3 kids how to be a good father. Bible tells us there are certain demonstrations of maturity that should be present before someone is ordained into a pastoralship. 1 Timothy chapter 3, he must be grave and sober, not sober from alcohol, serious-minded, capable of mature thought, capable of demonstrating maturity. Even a deacon must be grave. And in that same chapter, it said deacons must be grave, and they are to, quote, first be proved, unquote. What's that got to do with John? John had to demonstrate every one of these things before he was ordained to be an apostle. He had met every one of these things. Not only that, but he was chosen to be the inner circle with Christ. Now, I have a lot of acquaintances. And some of you may have heard this. To me, an acquaintance is someone that I know about and may or may not have met. I know quite a bit about President Biden. Well, that's far stretched. I wouldn't even call him an acquaintance. But an acquaintance is someone that I know distantly. I know who they are. I know a few things about them. Then I have people that I consider friends. People that I know fairly well. People that I am comfortable being around. And people that I could carry on a conversation with. Then I have some close friends. These would be people that I would be perfectly comfortable going out to eat with them, sitting down, just enjoy talking with them. And then I have a very, very, very few close friends. These are people that I could discuss a personal problem with and feel comfortable talking to them. I know it's not going to go any farther. I know it's not going to be repeated. These are people that I know well enough that I feel comfortable talking a problem or a situation with them. I have quite a few in that circle. But right now, Brother Gordon and I were talking about this when he was here a few months ago. I would consider him a very close friend. But he and I were talking that ever since Brother Jerry died a few years ago, I have never let anyone get into the innermost circle. When Brother Jerry died, I still have a lot of very, very, very close friends. But I don't have anyone, and I told Brother Gordon, part of it is me. I won't let anyone that in again after he died. But he was somebody we talked at least once or twice every week. We could talk about hunting, which he kept saying, I'm going to make a hunter out of you. Well, he died before he got a chance, but we could talk about anything and everything or just nothing. We could spend hours together and not feel obligated to carry on. And I told Brother Gordon, I said, I have never had anyone to take Brother Jerry's place. And he's been dead. He died in 2020. No, he died in 2018. He died in 2018. We had an agreement worked out. If I died first, he was preaching my funeral. If he died first, I was preaching his funeral. When he died, I was in rehab from the latter. I was in rehab, and the doctor would not release me to travel that far to preach the funeral. So Brother Gordon stepped in, and from all reports, did an excellent job. Now, I said that Jesus had disciples. Jesus had 12 apostles. Jesus, out of those 12, had 3 that were the inner circle. And out of those 3, John is the disciple that's noted over and over and over. John is noted as the disciple whom Jesus love. Many disciples, 12 apostles, 3 inner circle. John was the only one that was called the man that Jesus loved. That shows you his position in the hierarchy, if you will. What a blessing to be a disciple and to hear Jesus teach. What a blessing to be an apostle and enjoy being with Jesus every day. What a blessing to be the inner 3. And I did a quick search to see how many times and what circumstances the Bible refers to Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. There were miracles that Jesus performed that nobody was allowed in the room except Peter, James, and John. On the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus took Peter, James, and John. What a thrill. What a opportunity. When Jesus went up to the mountain and was transfigured, and Moses and Elijah came down and talked with Jesus. You know who was there? The only ones that saw Jesus transformed, that saw Moses and Elijah, Peter, James, and John. What a great privilege. And then among those 3, to be the one out of all of them that Jesus, the man that Jesus loved. At the last dinner, which is the beginning of the Lord's Supper, who was it that leaned on Jesus' breast? And the other said, hey, ask him who's going to deny him. You know who the only one that was privileged to lean on his breast? The only one that the other apostles trusted. They knew Jesus would answer. John. John. And yet we also see that John was a very meek and humble man. And I'm only going to give 2 points. Each one's got 3 points under them, but remember when the women went to the tomb and saw the stone rolled away? They went running back to the apostles and said, Jesus is alive. 2 men raced to the tomb, Peter and John. They raced to the tomb. Do you know which one of those 2 got there first? John got there first. But instead of rushing in, he stepped to the side, and out of respect to Peter, he said, Peter, you go in first. John wrote the book of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. I left out Revelation the other night, so I got Revelation in there this time. If you read all of those books, John doesn't refer to himself as anything special. In John chapter 1, he begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In 1 John, he begins with that which we have seen, that which we have heard, that which we have handled. He begins 1 John talking about Jesus Christ. In 2nd and 3rd John, he simply refers to himself as an elder. He didn't, I'm an apostle. I was special. I was Jesus' favorite. He simply wrote the elder unto the elect lady. Now, I understand what Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 15. Galatians 1:15, Paul acknowledged that he was born and saved by sovereign grace. Let me read it to you. If you want to turn Galatians 1:15, listen at what Paul wrote. He said, when it pleased God. I could stop right there. When it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb. Why was I born when countless thousands of others died in the womb? A friend of mine recently, just a few weeks ago, I saw her back a few months ago. She just found out she was pregnant. Went 8 months, everything's fine, no problems, everything's going good. And somewhere just past the 8th month, the baby died in the womb. She had to go through labor and everything. Why was I born? Because it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb. So Paul acknowledged his birth was based on the sovereignty of God. And then it pleased God, who called me by his grace. We understand that God is in complete control of our life. But that does not mean that we're to sit on the stool and do nothing. If any man desire the work of a bishop, he desireth a good work. And then Paul begins to give. All right, he desires a good work. He desires to preach, and only God can give you that desire. But he desires to preach. Now, before he's ordained, this is what he must do. God separated him from the womb. God called him, but now he must be blameless. He must be sober. He must do these things. God doesn't save you and say, okay, do whatever you want to. We still must meet his qualifications. I feel God leading me to go jump off the Empire State Building. Does that fit with God's word? Where does it say, oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Satan tried to get Jesus to jump off the pinnacle of the temple, and Jesus said, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. God has called me to service. Whether it's teach Sunday school, whether it's to be some other disciple. But that still means that I will give an account to God for the deeds done in this body. Well, it's all in the sovereign hands of God. I heard one preacher, I'm not sure if I was in college or just recently graduated. He said, God is working all things out. And this is his words. We are like puppets. You know, God pulls, God moves, and we really have no control. And I thought, then how can God say that every man is going to give an account to God for the deeds done in this body if God forced him to do that? See, God is sovereign, but he also expects us to live according to his word. John was saved, scripturally baptized, added to the church, chosen to be an apostle, ordained to be an apostle, became one of Christ's inner circles, became the closest of Christ. But as we'll see when we get there, John still had to live according to God's word. None of that mattered. He still had to live in accordance with God's word.